You're listening to Radio VR in Washington. I'm Ric Young. On the line from Austin, Texas, we have with us Ted Rall. He's the author of his new books, Silk Road to Ruin, Is Central Asia the New Middle East, and The Anti-American Manifesto. His website is tedrall.com. Ted, you're also a cartoonist, I should say Pulitzer-nominated cartoonist, and you've got a great article that's on commondreams.org, and of course at your website, what the media can't or won't tell you about why Russia invaded Ukraine. You bring up some really great points about how America's foreign correspondents aren't really giving us the complete picture. Why do you think that is? And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rick. I appreciate it. Well, in the article, which is part of my syndicated column, I mentioned the language law that was passed the day after the Ukrainian parliament the new Ukrainian parliament officially deposed the former president. And, one of their first acts was to revoke a 2012 law that established Russian as one of the official languages of Ukraine in regions that had more than a 10% Russian-speaking population. And that sent this huge signal to the Russian-speaking minority, and in Crimea a majority, since Crimea is 59% Russian, that bad things were about to happen. But the American media didn't know that, didn't catch that. For them, they viewed this as proxy war, proxy conflict between Russia and the United States. And for them, it's all about Obama. They've personalized it between Obama and Putin. And really, the truth is that there's the history of the dissolution of the Soviet Union that is behind all this. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there were 25 million Russians caught living in 14 other former Soviet republics, not including Russia, and many of them had been there for generations. But all sorts of discrimination suddenly began as the new countries, such as Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and so on, started creating their new nation states from the ground up, and nationalism was part of that witch's brew. And so many of these countries adopted policies that were designed to drive the Russian speakers out. In Tajikistan, for example, in 1989, just as the Soviet Union was starting to fall apart, the Tajik SSR passed one of these language laws, and 10 years later, 85% of the population was gone. Now, Americans, journalists and news consumers alike, look at this and they say, well, what's the big deal? Lots of people speak Spanish in the United States, for example, and it's where there's not a 85% exodus from the country because Spanish isn't an official language of the United States. But over in the former USSR, that was the first step, sort of like the way the Nuremberg laws in Germany in 1936 were a first step toward what ultimately happened during World War II. And so then further laws passed where Russians could no longer own property, they couldn't hold jobs, and there was no way for them to live, and so many of them some of them were stripped of all nationality and rendered stateless. And so they were forced to return to Russia. And that return really should be in quotes, because in many cases these were people who had never been to Russia and were every bit as much residents and citizens of these countries as they were of the Soviet Union. And so this history is something that I'm familiar with because I've traveled throughout Central Asia and the Caucasus and Russia, and these language laws are something that are really important, and when they come up, all alarm bells go off. So when here you have Ukraine in the middle of this huge crisis with Russia, and the country is in an upheaval, and when one of the very first acts of the rump Ukrainian parliament is to pass a law that restores Ukrainians' status as the sole national language, what seems like a relatively minor move to us comes off sends these shocking signals to the Russian population of Ukraine, and they think, oh my God, what's going to happen to us? Especially, we're not talking about something that happened sort of by happenstance. We're talking about it was
Right.
one of the very first acts that they did. It happened 24 hours later.
And let's talk about the ultra-nationalist group, Swoboda, that's in power at this point, or has most of the power there. Is this, in some respects, lost on the American media? Because, as you said, there appears to be more of an emphasis of Obama versus Putin, Putin versus Obama. This is a proxy Cold War, as opposed to looking at this story as an international crisis with very, very intranational problems.
Yeah, well, I mean, the roots to the politics of this, of course, for Russians and for Ukrainians, really go back to World War II. The Nazis established a Ukrainian puppet regime that Swoboda is kind of an heir to today. Ideologically, it's far right. It has many of the trappings of far-right Ukrainian nationalism that the Nazis attempted to exploit during World War II for their anti-Russian sentiment. So there is certainly that's not the entire Ukrainian opposition to the former president, Yanukovych, but it is absolutely a major part of the politics today. And it is, I think, intentionally lost by the Obama administration, who's obviously well aware of it, because they have a different agenda. But what is perplexing is that the media is so willing to go along with it. Now, in my column, I talk about some of the problems with the American and I guess Western media in general, and one of them is knee-jerk patriotism. The idea that you attend a U.S. government press conference, you listen to you record what they say, you transcribe it, you report it, and you assume that your government is essentially benevolent and that any rivals to that government, whether it be Russia or Iran or China, are inherently, if not evil, certainly ill-intentioned. And that's something we see in the media a lot, and it's a real problem. I mean, I really think journalists, in a way, shouldn't consider themselves to be citizens of any country. They should consider themselves to be citizens of the truth. Looking for what is going on and reporting what they see as best as they can.
But haven't you? But haven't you seen this happen in this 24-hour cable news cycle? In that we've got the pictures, we've got the sound bites, we've got the explosions, the fire, and then we have maybe the story on it. In the sense that whoever's got it first, of course, they win, but not much context, not much depth.
No, I mean, it's infotainment for sure. And, we need, with television needs visuals. And things that blow up, things that look cool are going to draw viewers. If you don't have visuals, it's pretty hard to get people interested. You're not going to get viewers. And, the networks like to blame the viewers for not caring about these stories. But the truth is it's a lot more complicated than that. Years ago, I had a radio show in Los Angeles where, as a joke, I started covering news from the most obscure countries in the world just for fun and just to sort of make a point that Americans didn't care about this stuff. But the joke turned out to be on me because it became the most popular segment of my program. The ratings were always highest then. It turned out that there's a huge thirst and hunger among the American people to find out what's really going on. And I think there's space there for someone to figure out how to deliver the crux of the story. People want to know what's going on in Ukraine, and you could watch hours of coverage and never really know. There's a space to inform people, I think.
The article we're talking about is what the media can't or won't tell you about why Russia invaded Ukraine. Ted, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us on Radio VR here in Washington.
Thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate it.
All right, have a good day.
You too.
You're listening to Radio VR in Washington. I'm Ric Young. On the line from Austin, Texas, we have with us Ted Rall. He's the author of his new books, Silk Road to Ruin, Is Central Asia the New Middle East, and The Anti-American Manifesto. His website is tedrall.com. Ted, you're also a cartoonist, I should say Pulitzer-nominated cartoonist, and you've got a great article that's on commondreams.org and, of course, at your website, what the media can't or won't tell you about why Russia invaded Ukraine. You bring up some really great points about how America's foreign correspondents aren't really giving us the complete picture. How many correspondents have you seen, at least on TV or possibly heard on the radio, that have talked about how most either superpower or just large nations generally move in the direction of what they feel is a threat to their national interest? Obviously, the U.S. has done that several times in memory. Is that really being conveyed to the American public or to an international audience that Russia, whether one agrees with the troops there or not, that they feel that they need to protect their national interests there?
Well, certainly not. And what's really missing is the obvious analogies here. I mean, nobody is ever saying, well, how would the United States react if there were upheaval on its borders in Canada or Mexico? We know how the U.S. would act. The U.S. Certainly views its sphere of influence as much larger than Russia views its own sphere of influence. And there's no way that if there were if an American military, like for example, if the American military base at Guantanamo were threatened by, say, the Cuban government, there's no way that the U.S. would not react by probably invading Cuba. I mean, we've done it before, and we might do it again. The United States, and it's hilarious. Just yesterday, Obama was talking about how the world cannot allow democratically elected leaders of Ukraine to be ignored by Russia as borders are redrawn. Really? Who are these democratically elected leaders of Ukraine that he's talking about? The democratically elected president of Ukraine has been overthrown. Whether you call this a coup or a revolution, the fact is it's not a democratic process. And whether you're in favor of it or not, it's not a democratic process by definition. And to call it a democratic process is just an insult. It's an Orwellian insult to language. But it's that's what's constantly missing from American foreign policy coverage on both TV and on radio and also in print. This sense of like, well, what if we were in this position? What would we do? The United States invaded Iraq halfway around the world because of a supposed threat caused by non-existent weapons of mass destruction. And, Ukraine, certainly there's far more justification for Russia to invade Crimea than there was for the United States to invade even Afghanistan.
How about the coverage of the issue of ethnicity in Russia? I've been learning more about it myself, but we tend to look at least we in America tend to look at Russia as one big, massive, monolithic country, and it really isn't. Not
at all. It's really, it was created as an empire, and it's still an empire. You can see, if you look at the imagery of the Russian troops in Crimea, for example, you can just look at the faces and see that the huge variety of Eurasian people. You have people who look very Asian. There's ethnic Mongols. There's Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks. People from the Caucasus, and very European people as well, looking people. So this is a vast country. People forget it's the biggest country on the planet, and there isn't a very close number two either. It's a very huge place, and it's been cobbled together and the loyalties are just like anywhere, very complicated. There are tribal loyalties, but there are regional loyalties. There's nationalism, and it all interplays all at the same time. It's no one thing. It's everything all mixed up, and it's in a way no one will, even a Russian policy expert will never know Russia. No one can really know a country like that or a country as big as the United States. It's just too complicated. But there's no sense of that complexity, that's for sure, being delivered. Well, you mentioned that complexity in your article. You write about Turkmenistan. It's a Central Asian dictatorship, as you write. Talk about how the Russian people there were treated after 1991. Yeah, well, before 1991, they were kind of colonizers. They had a privileged position under the Soviet period. And suddenly their world fell apart. And so when the new Turkmenistan government, which is sort of the old party boss of Turkmenistan, took over, Sapir Murat Niyazov, he established a cult of personality all around himself that's kind of famous. And one of the first, they had to make this country from scratch. It's in the middle of the desert. There's not much there. It's very sparsely populated, 2 million people. So they had to, create a flag, make up currency, stamps, et cetera, et cetera. And it was I'm sure a daunting challenge for them. And one of the things that they did was they decided early on to institute a policy of Turkmenization in order to give privileged positions to ethnic Turkmen people over the Russians who had been, in some cases, living there for many generations, because Turkmenistan became part of the Soviet Union in the 20s. So so the idea. So first, they passed a law stripping away a dual nationality. It started with the language law, went on to the dual nationality law, where everyone had to choose Russian or Turkmen citizenship, but that doesn't seem like that big a deal because you still have citizenship. But then you need to, if you didn't speak Turkmen, which is a very difficult and different language. It's a Turkic language. For Russians, it's very hard for them to learn. If you didn't speak it well, you wouldn't qualify for any kind of government job. And you say, oh, well, that's okay, you could work in the private sector. But in a dictatorship like Turkmenistan, basically the entire economy is the government sector. So you might be able to work as a taxi driver, maybe, or as a waitress. And so, by 2003, some 12 years after the breakup, Russian speakers were becoming homeless. They were living in dire poverty, and and many of them had been forced to go to Russia, even though they didn't know anyone, and they had to try to build a life from scratch and in a difficult economic situation. They were really treated very, very poorly, and this is a story that's been repeated throughout the former Soviet Union. There is not one Commonwealth of Independent States nation that has not eliminated dual citizenship in an effort to get rid of Russians. So it's a big problem. And when now that law, I've been contacted by people since my column appeared online to point out that the president has sent the acting president of Ukraine has vetoed that law. But that sends a signal when the new parliament under the new government passes a law. It's analogous to Arizona's the law that was recently vetoed by Governor Jan Brewer that would have allowed businesses to discriminate against gays. Sure, the law's been vetoed, but gays know that Arizona is not a very gay-friendly place. And so similarly, Russian speakers in Ukraine know that the new regime in Ukraine is not a very friendly place to them. Things weren't so bad under the previous government of Yanukovych, but they are now.
You also talk about in your article, which I find very interesting, and this is not the first time many of us in the business have heard this criticism, is that there aren't many foreign bureaus any longer. A lot of foreign coverage is out of London, the London Bureau, maybe some stringers are out there. But journalists right now, despite the fact that we have so many companies that provide us news, that especially American companies, are cutting back on foreign bureaus where people actually get out, meet the people, talk to them, and get a firsthand look at either the culture or the political system there. Do you see that? Obviously you see that as a bad thing for us because we don't have these foreign bureaus where journalists actually understand the people they're covering.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, journalism has been afflicted by a bean counter corporate mentality for the last few decades, at least. And one of the first things to go was foreign bureaus. And the truth is that there was a time 40, 50 years ago when an American newspaper would be considered not to be doing a decent job if it didn't have a bureau representative or chief in every major country on the planet, just in case something happened. And I'm sure at some point accountants came in and said, well, why are we paying someone to sit in Uganda when nothing has happened in Uganda for a year? Because just in case it does, you want someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And it will someday. And it's not that these outlets can't afford it. There are so many unemployed journalists who would be willing to do this work. There are many stringers overseas, but it's just foreign coverage is not considered a priority anymore. And the result, it shows the quality is bad. And people aren't stupid. They might not know exactly what it is that they're not getting, but they know that they're missing something. And I think after a while, they just stop paying attention.
Well, Ted, you bring up a lot of good points about American coverage of foreign events, not just this crisis, but others, where we tend to get a homogenized look at the world through either cable TV or broadcast. And as you say, the resources are there, but apparently there are those in the business who feel that they shouldn't spend their money for that kind of coverage, that a stringer can do it. And as I have to agree with you that in many ways, the American public is cheated through its American outlets in not getting the kind of balanced coverage of a crisis like this or others. However, we do have others like Al Jazeera, obviously the Voice of Russia, BBC, all other international news outlets that certainly cover this. But I'm sure you agree, most Americans go to American news outlets, right?
Yeah, most Americans go to, in the same way that most French people go to French news outlets, most Americans go to American outlets. It's the path of least resistance. It's what's advertised, and these are the channels that have the low numbers on the dial on your cable your cable television. So it's just easier. It takes a little bit more work to check out foreign news sources, and news geeks like me will do it, and I do it. But it's not. It's really sad, and I have to think that something's going to change. I'd like to think, but it's been a long time.
You're right about that. Ted, it's been great talking with you. It's been a pleasure. I want to get people to your website. It is tedrall.com. And Ted, you're the author of your new book, Silk Road to Ruin, Central Asia, the New Middle East, and the Anti-American Manifesto. And anything new coming up for you?
Well, I've got a new book coming out this fall in August called After We Kill You, We Will Welcome You as Honored Guests, Unembedded in Afghanistan.
All right. Interesting title. Well, let's talk again, Ted. It's been a pleasure again. And the article we're talking about is What the Media Can't or Won't Tell You About Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. Ted, thanks again. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us on Radio VR here in Washington.
Thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.